We're on, sir. Jai Hind and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Adi Achint. Understanding the Indian maritime domain is something that I think a lot of us have missed out in our endeavor to understand Indian national security. In that particular paradigm, I thought, why don't we actually look at the Indian Navy in a broader sense to understand what, firstly, does the Navy do apart from sailing its big ships on both sides of the country and protecting India's coastline, what else are the responsibilities of the Indian Navy? How does it go forward with it? And how does it actually do its job? After which, of course, discussing the threats that the Indian Navy has and how does it plan to counter them. To discuss this, a very large subject, a subject which is gaining great importance today, I have with me Admiral Anup Singh, who was the former commander of the fleet in the Eastern Fleet of the Indian Navy, and of course, a strategic thinker and a speaker. I've heard him speak multiple times. The clarity of thought and the strategic vision is something that I admire. Thank you, sir, for joining me to help us understand the Indian Navy a little more than what we should.
Thank you, Adi. Pleasure to be here. Um, it's a. You rightly put it across to the viewers that it is a very important subject, primarily because I've always said that uh, the human being is basically a continental creature. With feet on terra firma, there's hardly about 0.005% of the human race which puts out to sea in merchant ships. Another 0.5% which goes out shipping or for pleasure cruises. The rest of us always feel that the most important uh, arena to be in is terra firma because our feet are on terra firma. We live on terra firma. And we don't realize and we don't appreciate the importance of the seas, forgetting a very basic and a very, very critical point in our lives that between 37 and 43% of the GDP of any maritime nation is dependent upon the seas because without imports and exports, even landlocked countries cannot survive. But the boost to the economy comes from an EXIM trade, and that is carried only by merchant ships on the seas. Now, what is the role of a navy? The role of any navy is firstly to protect the maritime frontiers. And who else would be more aware than Indians who lost their independence when they lost touch with the seas? Starting with foreign powers from the West coming in and taking over and finally colonizing us for more than 2 centuries. Therefore, the most important requirement for a maritime nation to have a maritime force within the Indian Navy, for example, is to firstly protect the seas around us against any power that may be having intentions of either exploiting the resources in the sea or of conquest or of taking over of even a small part of the territory. We have, by the way, the second largest peninsula in the world. Very few of us Indians realize that. The largest being the Arabian Peninsula, which is comprised of 10 nations, including landlocked Jordan. And we, a single country, owns the second largest peninsula in the world at almost 2.2 million square kilometers, which gives us 5,700 miles of 5,700 kilometers of coastline. The balance 2,000 comes from the island states in the west and the east, including the Andaman Nicobar Islands. Now you realize the strategic importance of the islands, particularly in the east. It is a strategic outpost. It is, as we've been calling it, the unsinkable aircraft carrier. But to protect even the Andaman Nicobar Islands, which are composed of 572 islands, and seas the exclusive economic zone of India at 2.02 million square kilometers. No one realizes that 600,000 square kilometers of this comes from the Andaman Nicobar Islands, because you are allowed to have an EEZ of 200 nautical miles from the baselines on the coast. So that's the kind of assets that we have accumulated, and we need to exploit to their full potential, not just for fishing, but mineral resources as well. Who protects these vital interests of India? The EEZ, the the maritime frontiers, the shipping lanes, most importantly, which carry our trade, which, as I said, depending on the cost of oil that we import, and we import almost 78% of our total requirement of oil and gas through the sea route. The balance is just about 20 or 22%, which comes from Bombay offshore, Bombay High, and from the Krishna Godavari basin, and on land, of course. But importantly, uh, to protect these sea lines of communication, it is the Navy which is required to be at its best insofar as potential is concerned. But there are many other roles of the Navy. You know, some of the best IR theorists who had nothing to do being within the, insofar as service in a Navy is concerned, wrote some of the most important books which have become must read for naval officers. Ken Booth, a British author, was an IR theorist who's written a seminal piece called Navies and Diplomacy. Another great book has been written by James Cable. Both of them had nothing to do with the Navy. But the greatest guy was insofar as importance of navies is concerned, was the great British philosopher and, of course, commander in chief in seaways in the 17th century, who famously declared that a man of war, which is the meaning of which is a warship, is the best ambassador. So navies have also been known for diplomacy in all its hues, from sweet diplomacy to even gunboat diplomacy, if and when required. Similarly, one of the important roles of a navy of a large maritime nation like ours is assistance to countries which may request either for assistance in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief in situations of cyclones, drought, medical emergencies, pandemics, for example. In the last, during the COVID-19 phase 1 and phase 2, the large number of consignments we carried by ships to littorals in the East African region, as also evacuating Indians from many of these countries who requested to be evacuated to India, which was much safer, and to come home to their families. So there are so many roles that a navy can perform that other forces cannot, mainly because of A, mobility, B, endurance, which means staying power, and C, most importantly, reach, that a ship without having to fuel can go up to the Persian Gulf, come back. A warship or frigate or destroyer size can go to any part of the East African littoral and come back. Of course, we have logistic ships as well, which go along with flotillas or the entire fleet.
Thank you for that, I think, very clear introduction on what the Navy does. Uh, it's a wonder, a lot of us never understand the kind of scope of operations and the size of operations that the Indian Navy has just on the coastline of the country, leaving apart venturing into the deep blue seas. Uh, may I request you if you can tell us how is the Navy deployed in the various areas of interest that we have? Uh, I believe there are 7 strategic points that we cover in the oceans, and how are they deployed? What are the kind of force that we have, and what is the staying power of the navy in these deployment areas?
A very good question. Adi, starting 2017, because of not just because we had mastered the ability and had harnessed sufficient forces, but because of requirements and because of the geopolitical dynamics, which saw a very major shift in the Indo Pacific, and particularly um, everyone talks of India being at the center of gravity. Other than things that have gone taken a turn for the worse in the South China Sea, that a lot of countries depend on India to show up its presence in various areas. So in 2017, as you know, we had a problem in the Persian Gulf where the tanker war started seeing a completely new paradigm, and therefore we first positioned one ship in the Persian Gulf to protect our own tankers or tankers chartered by India for carrying oil or gas from through the Strait of Hormuz into Indian ports like Kandla, etc. Subsequently, when we found that things had become a little more tight because of tensions in the Persian Gulf between certain nations, we positioned two ships. So once one of the biggest hotspots was the Persian Gulf, and the second place where we have had presence of at least one ship all the time, which does a tenure of about 3 months generally, has been the Gulf of Aden since 2008, since August of 2008, when piracy had started surging so heavily that, and one of the Indian ships had got hijacked and there were calls for ransom by the pirates, as well as in Somalia, who had taken refuge in Somalia, as well as um, keeping the almost 22 Indian crews in a ship hostage. So since that particular time, the Navy has been positioning one ship, and till this day, that one ship is doing in the transit route in the Gulf of Aden, which has a length of almost 540 nautical miles. Uh, a, 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 a kind of a patrol which is generally coordinated along with some other friendly navies. So that becomes the second ship, mission based deployment. The third ship, which shows up every now and then, is in the central Indian Ocean, which means between Sri Lanka, Maldives, and India. And you know there are reasons to keep a ship over there, not only for making sure that these waters, which are our backwaters, are free of um, unwanted interference, unwanted forays by some other ships, and also to provide assistance in keeping these two countries EEZ under surveillance. The third place is the Southwest Indian Ocean, which means between the Mozambique Channel or close to Madagascar. And
Madagascar.
uh, one more mission-based deployment is in the mouth of the Malacca, and one is in the mouth of the near the mouth of the Lombok, and one in the Bay of Bengal of the Andaman Nicobar Islands. So there are generally seven hotspots where we cannot afford because of we cannot afford to keep all ships all the time. So we do staggering and we do deployments uh, based on inputs as well as on a turnaround which can be staggered between air platforms like the P8I aircraft of the Navy, which take off from a shore, and whenever they find something unusual, a ship is deployed. And now you asked a very important question as to how are they turned around, or what about their logistic support? Now, the difference between a brown water, the green water, and a blue water navy is that brown water navies are supposed to be those navies where those for of those nations which cannot afford to have a large army. and they generally are accepted to be looking after just immediate coastal areas within 100 nautical miles from the shore. Green Water Navy uh, is one which can look after far beyond the coastal area and can look after those areas where they can go without logistic support and come back even after an offensive raid. Blue water navies are very few at the moment. The PLA Navy is not reached there as yet. One would be surprised, even though it has got
Numbers.
355 warships today, and they claim to be larger than the US Navy. Numbers don't really matter. It is expeditionary capability with large vessels which can carry troops, which can carry aircraft, which can carry fuel, provisions, and anything that requires sustenance at sea. Um, and those navies which have logistic support ships, which in the old days used to be called tankers, now you call them fleet support ships, which carry not only diesel fuel, aviation fuel for aircraft on carriers and on frigates and destroyers, for
Mhm. Mhm.
helicopters, and they also carry a large amount of water. They carry provisions, they carry frozen provisions in their cold rooms, and they have large ammunition spaces where they can carry um, ammunition for ships, including missiles or, or shells for guns in very secure magazines. And they carry workshops, and they have workshops so that with technical manpower, so that any repair or replacement or maintenance which is not possible by the ship's own crew, defect rectification can be done at sea. Now, those navies which have these kinds of vessels called the logistic support or fleet support vessels, they are called blue water navies. Now, how do we do turnaround of ships from these mission-based deployments? First of all, we have memoranda of understanding with most friendly maritime nations, particularly in the Indian Ocean region, but also far beyond, far beyond in the Pacific and the Atlantic, by the way. Now, to give you an example, a ship that goes into the Persian Gulf can call into a port of Oman. It can call into a port like Djibouti. It can call into a port anywhere else in the Persian Gulf. And that is for not just taking, replenishing fuel or provisions, but also for a bit of R&R, which is a terminology used across the navies in the world to say rest and recreation
Mm.
for the crew.
Yeah.
Um, no doubt, naval personnel are supposed to have long sea legs like their ships, and they are supposed to sustain at sea for long periods. But it is always good uh, to keep in mind human fatigue, and
Mhm.
they are their best efficiency when they go through R.
Indeed, I think it's endearing to know that India has a certain reach. Of course, we would all dream and want a larger reach than what we have, but let's work with what we have right now and look at the future. But before we get to that future point, sir, I'd like to ask you about our structure of the fleet. Uh, there is a Western fleet, there's the Eastern fleet, and there is something known as the Indian fleet. It is, to me, it is very complicated to understand, and I'd request you to kind of help us understand these fleets. Apart from that, what do they carry, and how do ships get allocated to these fleets?
Um, a very good question for the viewers to understand this terminology. When you say the US fleet, it doesn't mean that there is only one fleet in the US Navy. Similarly, when you call the Indian fleet by this term, it doesn't really mean that there is only one Indian fleet. Actually, in India, Indian Navy has two operational fleets. The Western Fleet, which has its headquarters in Mumbai, which I commanded in 2006 2007, and the Eastern Fleet, headquartered at Vishakhapatnam, which also has a large number of ships. And um, uh, well, submarines come directly under the commander in chief, either of the Western Naval Command or the Eastern Naval Command. So submarines do not form part of the fleet because submarines have a completely different role, and they need to be ordered for deployment as well as controlled from ashore by the commander in chief and his staff. Um, so the term fleet really means it's a loosely coined term, and it has been customary to say that the French fleet, or the British fleet, or the Indian fleet. It means the total number of ships and submarines that are within a navy. They are loosely called the fleet of that particular country. But strictly speaking, when you name a particular fleet, you have to be specific to say, are you talking of the Western Fleet of the Indian Navy, the Eastern Fleet of the Indian Navy? And in Cochin, we do not have a fleet. The Southern Naval Command is a training command, but there are training ships which also perform a very important role of training officer cadets in particular for a 6-month tenure. And Cochin also has some other small patrol vessels for harbor defense or coastal defense, patrol boats. Similarly, when you talk of the American Navy, the U.S. Navy, now there is the Fifth Fleet, which has its headquarters which is based in the Mediterranean. The Seventh Fleet, with its headquarters at Yokosuka in Japan, and so on and so forth. There are some fleets which are on mainland America, which have their headquarters in mainland America. So that is how you term fleets, in colloquially calling the entire accumulation of a navy's ships into one term called the fleet.
So the Indian Navy has been termed as the most strategic thought uh, process driven force amongst the three forces in India. It's always had that edge. Uh, I'd like you to kind of explain to us post independence. How did it achieve that particular stature that it's got today? Because we know that the Navy also performs a lot of R&D, which the other forces are trying to do today. But the Navy's been the first, I would say, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, Atmanirbhar sort of a force in itself. Uh, can you tell us the story of how it came to being where we are today? And of course, the next I'll like to ask you with some supplements, the future course as well, sir.
Okay. At the time of independence, the 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 name of the Navy of India was Royal Indian Navy, because it was still commanded by the British, even though ships had their captains who were pure Indians.
Mhm.
But the structure and the chain of command and the higher echelons of the hierarchy of the Indian Navy still had flag officers and some other people up to the rank of Commodore and Captain who were from the British Royal Navy, because there were very few Indian officers who had gone up in rank as yet. Also, uh, it is only in 1950, on 26 Jan 1950, that we declared ourselves a republic and became completely independent insofar as armed forces were concerned. Therefore, it is at that time that the RIN, Royal Indian Navy, converted itself into the Indian Navy. Now, long before India gained independence, the process of planning was being done, um, once again by a chief of naval staff who was a British gentleman. But the director of naval plans and his officers were all Indian. And I think the first plan paper came out in 1946. I'm sorry, the director of naval plans was a British gentleman, but all other officers under him were Indians.
Okay.
Now, there are files which would still be there, I happened to be DNP in 1998, and I remember having seen one of those files uh, under signatures of a young Indian naval officer, at that time a young naval officer who finally retired as a CNC of the Western Naval Command in the late 70s or early 80s. Uh, and everyone above him, again Indian naval officers, not only concurred but said add more of being a builder's navy. And the essence of this paper, the first plan paper, was that there is no way that we will become a buyer's navy or a navy which is dependent upon either the British, even after independence, or on other powers for our platforms. We must be able to build platforms in India. We must be able to design platforms in India. And we must be able to become self sufficient. So, the term self reliance that is being spoken so frequently today, and particularly under the national ethos of Atmanirbharta, was imbibed by the Indian Navy well before independence. And in this plan paper of 1948, we said whatever we need today, because in 1947, people would be amazed to know that we had received a motley group of vessels which couldn't really be called warships, including two sloops, two frigates, four odd minesweepers, four odd trawlers, and a couple of motor launches for harbor defense. Similarly, Pakistan received a few sloops and frigates and so on. Now, this was by no stretch of imagination sufficient even for Mumbai harbor and the coastal areas around the west coast of India. So there were plans made in 1948 as well, the plan paper of 48, which said that some very quick acquisitions need to be made because nothing gets made today in India, even though the Wadia masters were so good in Mumbai when they set up their first building dock that the British Royal Navy in UK used to depend in the 17th and 18th centuries um, on wooden hulls, warships being made by the Wadia masters.
Wow.
But we lost touch with the sea, as we know, as I said earlier. And therefore, we lost touch with all kinds of art and science in building a navy and maintaining a navy. And that touch came back after independence. And thanks to these initial planners after independence, that they insisted that self-reliance and indigenization is the only route by which a maritime nation can survive and not be dependent for criticalities during times of crisis and conflict on foreign powers. As you saw in 1998, when we had Pokhran 2, we were placed under sanctions by almost the entire Western world, the suppliers of the world.
Mhm.
And that was another occasion, a turning point, where we shook ourselves up and said, whatever little is left insofar as the indigenization path is concerned, particularly in electronics, we must now encourage the DRDO and even other establishments to start moving towards self-reliance. And a lot was achieved, which cannot be spoken in the open domain. But a lot was achieved insofar as um, modern electronics is concerned, particularly sensors. So that was the reason that we created an organization called VESO, which today is called VESI, which means Weapons and Electronics Engineering something establishment. Now, VESO was created in 1978 in a hired house in central Delhi, um, before being converted into Vesi, what it is today, in one part of the defense headquarters. And it is as good as an autonomous organization, even though it is under the Ministry of Defense. But you would be amazed how much effort goes into giving them a long rope, and how advantageous it has been towards Atmanirbharta. I mean, the most modern systems that have come out on Indian platforms are put in are designed, developed, prototyped, lab tested, and finally put on ships from that establishment.
Fantastic.
Similarly, it is very important to understand that we have four defense PSUs which build ships.
Mhm.
Uh, Now, even though it is a good thing to do self critique, and we keep saying that, look, the public sector is a man hour eater, and therefore you can't have places where, because of being employment generation machines, you have such a large manpower. A lot of manpower has been multitasked over the last 20 years in these defense PSUs, starting with Mazagon Docks, the Garden Reach Shipbuilders and Engineers in Kolkata, the Goa Shipyard Limited in
Mm.
Goa, and the fourth one, which has been added only in 2009, is the Hindustan Shipyard Limited.
Yeah.
Uh, Leaving Hindustan Shipyard aside for a moment, the other three have done wonders. And if and there is the largest public sector shipbuilding yard, which is under the Ministry of Shipping, in Cochin, called the Kochi Shipyard, which was established long after independence in the early 80s with the help of Japanese company and the Japanese government. It was it in the public sector. It was built with the most modern infrastructure for shipbuilding. That shipyard is made the Vikrant, which is about to be commissioned within the next couple of days. Um, and that Vikrant is 40,000 tons in displacement. It is 262 meters long and 60 odd meters wide. It will carry a mix of fighter aircraft, helicopters, and in times to come, some drones, the UAVs, which can take off from platforms.
From the
And
platform.
it has a large array of sensors which have been designed, developed, and made in India. Some of the electronics have again been designed and developed in the organization that I just mentioned, and some have been made by the Bharat Electronics Limited.
Mhm.
Um, Now, these four defense PSUs, apart from the Kochi shipyard, which is under the Ministry of Shipping, um, have orders for about, I think, 38 or 39 warships
Mhm.
currently. Uh, and I mean, amongst about 41 ships which are on order, only two are being imported from abroad, that is from Russia. If
Russia,
things
yes.
If things improve, those two should come within the next year or two. And the balance two in that contract are going to be made as follow-ons. You'll be surprised, in Goa Shipyard Limited and in Hindustan Shipyard Limited. Goa has never made ships larger than corvettes. In fact, not even corvettes. They made smaller versions of corvettes in the late 80s, early 90s, which were just about 600, 550, 600 tons. For the first time, the Goa shipyard is going to make frigates, the 1135.6 follow-on frigates, the follow-ons of the Talwar class. The
Okay.
Talwar was commissioned, Talwar, Trishul, and Tabar were commissioned in Russia from Petersburg, St. Petersburg, the Admiralty shipyard, in 2003, 4, and 5. And the follow-ons are going to be delivered to by Russia and the balance by Goa shipyard and HSL. So that's the route of indigenization. Firstly, I said VESI. Secondly, the defense PSUs. Now, the Navy has also been very liberal in its thought process that we should not restrict ourselves only to PSUs. And we've been saying it for a very long time, involve and encourage the private sector,
Of course.
because there has been a mindset since our independence, because of certain circumstances, that anything which is classified must only be depended upon, must only be charged to the public sector undertakings.
Mm-hmm.
Armed forces and anything to do with them, whether they're platforms or designs or plans, are supposed to be classified. So this was a misnomer. Since 2013, the defense procurement procedure itself said there will be no further nomination. Now it will be an open field and equal opportunity even to the private sector. Now, in this country, you will get a proper, developed, and very versatile defense industrial base only if you do public private partnership.
Partnership series.
You open up defense sector to the private sector and encourage them to join in. One of the reasons that the private sector has also been a little reluctant, apart from this process of nomination of defense PSUs for a long time, till 2013, was that the number of orders that they will get will be limited to the first contract of 2 or 3 ships,
After that, what?
or, or just about 50 or 100 weapon systems for the army
Mm-hmm.
or the air force. Now they say that it is not economically possible or viable to set up an assembly line at a huge cost, do some technology transfer, or develop things themselves at a huge cost, and then start designing and producing, and then shut down the line. So, therefore, it has to be a process where the government encourages and the services also encourage the private sector.
Indeed, I think that is one of the biggest points. At the end of it, if you want to involve the private sector or even the government sector, they need to make money. I mean,
Yeah, that's right.
it's not a it's not a something that you can put in the bin. So, lastly, I'd like to close this. I think very enlightening introductory session on the Indian Navy, and just to tell all the viewers that we will be. This is basically just to set a base on the future discussions. We will be talking about threat perceptions. We will be talking about force projection. We will be talking about a whole lot of things, and of course, I would also want Admiral's views on uh, China, what his opinion is on the so-called largest navy in the world. So that's something that we'll keep for a later date. I'm just giving you a teaser here. So, coming to the last question, I mentioned a little bit about force projection, and I'd like you to just give us a little bit of a teaser in that particular aspect so that we tickle the viewers' fantasy in terms of what the Indian Navy can and has done. The question is that the Indian Navy till now has been called upon to put itself in certain situations. Uh, may it be an evacuation which happened in Yemen, may it be a ship sailing in the waters close to Greece, may it be a ship going through the Taiwan Strait, and a lot of people might be surprised to hear that, or some exercises which are going to upcoming in the South China Sea. So these are messaging platforms, force projection platforms, and so on and so forth. How does the Navy plan something like this, and what are our capacities as of date, sir?
To give you straight examples, the first time that some force projection was done in a situation of not just crisis but conflict brought upon by Pakistan was Kargil.
Mhm.
Now, at that time, the Western Fleet was complemented by a large number of ships from the Eastern Fleet, because Bay of Bengal did not have that kind of a problem. Uh, and the entire fleet the entire group of ships which were deployed within not just as one force, but in terms of task forces and task groups, were deployed in the North Arabian Sea. And the idea was to put pressure from that flank. One has to remember two things insofar as Pakistan is concerned. The most important thing is that it has only one port of any essence insofar as import dependence and lines of communication are concerned, and that is
Hmm.
Karachi.
Qasim.
Port Qasim, Port Qasim is just an elbow away from Karachi. It is like a sub depot of Karachi because of certain types of commodities that go in there. But both of them are adjacent to each other.
Yes.
Gwadar, even though it has the first phase was commissioned a long time ago, sometime in 2008 or 9, um, has not been a port of consequence insofar as impacts trade is concerned, except for the Chinese themselves. When CPEC finally gets concluded, we will have to see what is it, what kind of use it is being put to insofar as Pakistan itself is concerned. At the moment, everything, the lines of communication on over land are being developed by China for its own use from Goa. But therefore, the most important thing for the Indian Navy has always been whether in the 71 war, even though the war was taking place in the eastern theater in the Bay of Bengal, in the west was to put pressure insofar as the main sea lines of communication going to Karachi is concerned.
Hmm.
And we succeeded by declaring not even a blockade. We declared a blockade on the morning of the 4th December and withdrew that by the evening. We declared a contraband control in both the Arabian Sea and the Bay of Bengal,
Yeah.
particularly adjoining the two Pakistani coasts of the time. So therefore, in during the Kargil conflict, um, I think we called it Operation Talwar.
Salwar.
And what we did was that uh, put out task groups, apart from deploying some submarines, which one cannot talk about as to where they were deployed, in such a manner that the Pakistani forces did not venture to come out. And they were most worried about the lines of communication being choked because their dependence on exports as well as imports, critical exports, imports like oil and gas, which not only provide livelihood to the armed forces, but to to power stations and to the entire economy within the country, whether it is for running their cars or their trains or whatever else. So that flanking pressure was very effectively um, applied by the Indian Navy. The second time that we did this kind of a thing was during Operation Parakram after the attack on the Indian Parliament in 2001. And thereafter, of course, we've always shown our presence, but real force projection was done on these two occasions, the last time that we did. Whenever there is any hint of a crisis, one has to remember that at sea, seeing is believing. So while submarines are stealthy and they are put for sea denial under the surface and nobody comes to know where they are, the enemy keeps guessing and therefore is very worried about its own warships more than its merchant ships. The surface navy does its task by being seen either by the enemy adversaries' air platforms or by its own merchant ships passing on intelligence or its warships. So force projection is a game of the superior force, and by numbers, technology, and experience and efficiency, the Indian Navy, the Pakistan Navy doesn't stand a chance at the moment compared to the Indian Navy.
Thank you, sir, for that. Just a closing comment. I think it's just popped into my head. I'd like you to kind of tell us about the tradition that makes a difference between the Indian Navy. Yes, we forgot the seas, but India does have a huge sea tradition. How does that help the Indian Navy of today?
It's in our veins. So salt runs in our veins, and it's been there for ages and ages and ages. A lot of people talk about the first use of navigational techniques without a sextant by Ibn Majid from the Persian Gulf. But centuries before that, there are writings in our history books of Indians having taught to many parts of the world how to sail. After all, Lothal is not anywhere else in the world. It is here in our own on our own land in Gujarat.
So that's the note I think this program needs to be ended on, and it's a very positive note to be there, because a lot of us in I think, and this is something that I again like to discuss with you in the next, when we discuss this maritime threats, is that we've been so focused on towards our land borders, and yes, rightly so. There's no question about it that we've left the sea alone, and that I think is something uh, which is not correct for the enthusiasts, if I may, or the analysts, or people who are interested in strategic affairs to even fathom today. We must have an equal, you know, interest in both the areas. And today, I think the interest towards the sea needs to be a little more, because of the kind of stuff that we are in. Admiral Sir, thank you so much for this session, and of course, looking forward for future sessions discussing the maritime security challenge that India has, and the way forward that India has to go to achieve dominance or its security within the particular region. Till the next time, sir, thank you so much, and Jai Hind.
Thank you, Adi. Pleasure. Jai Hind.
Thank you, sir.